Alcove Bridge, written by Maksimenko, performed by Sadaf Khajeh. He was an ancient man by then, though it took him many years to come to terms with it. Arthur, lying in a hospital bed with a clip on his index finger and a tube in his dick. Boo-hoo, he thought, poor me, living to 93 and dying in bed. But he wasn't dead yet, which was proving unexpected. The bed he would die in was a common character in his life, showing up in nightmares and dreams alike. At 6 years old, he would imagine a daunting bed, big, broad, and mahogany, like his grandfather had lain in for the last 2 years of his life. Back then, the word cancer was still unutterable, a phantom lurking behind doctors' clipboards and whispered from ear to ear at the bedside of some great aunt when it was mentioned at all. Arthur later found out his grandfather had gotten diagnosed with liver cancer when Arthur was 6, supposedly an aggressive and deadly form, but the machinery had stalled somewhere along the way. The electric chair ran out of juice, he thought, or the firing squad took a smoke break. The executioner sneezed and his grandfather had lain in bed an extra 18 months, dwindling his mother's savings down to the last can of beans. By the end, Arthur was permitted to see him once every week or so, and on the good days, his grandfather's dry, stumpy hand would reach out and ruffle his golden hair, before succumbing to a fit of violent phlegmy coughs or retreating quietly back into the mass of blankets on the bed. His duty done, young Arthur would go out and play, but the bed stuck with him, the final parking spot of his grandfather's wandering soul. An eternity later, strolling with Marilyn, he would see a similar bed dumped on the side of the road, headboard cracked and halfway in the gutter, and thought, good, at least that one won't get me. But a hospital bed was always a possibility, and when the time finally came, he had arrived in his room like a long-awaited visitor, with open arms and toothless grin. So this is it, he thought, as the nurse got him situated. But he was still here, and worse still, something was nagging at him, some errand left undone, paperwork remaining before his final appointment. But he was unhurried, and sure, the formality would reveal itself in time, set to waiting. His mind wandered, and he found himself visiting memories like picking up stones on the beach, finding them rounded by time and incalculable distance, smooth and heavy in his palm, yet somehow still familiar. He supposed it was only proper, to preserve a sense of decorum, to think about his wedding day and the birth of his second child. He remembered the way Marilyn looked in poofy, dramatic white. Then he remembered holding little Mary in his arms, so small she could fit into one palm. Though he wouldn't dare hold her with anything less than 2, he ebbed in and out with the waves of consciousness, but began to feel uneasy. A face was lurking behind the wedding photographer, a figure hidden just out of sight of the room where Marilyn had given birth. That was a long time ago, he thought. I've dealt with that, and it's over. Been over. For many decades, 3/4 of a century. But the uneasiness didn't go away. He directed his attention to powerful memories, like rinsing with mouthwash, getting his first job, meeting Marilyn, the death of his brother, his grandfather, mother, and father. But soon all the faces were replaced with just one, Rosa. She seemed to hover, staring at him from the ceiling. She was behind a door and waiting in the bathroom. If he looked at his reflection, he was sure it'd be her that stared back at him. He shivered, and suddenly the hospital bed felt cold. He forced his eyes open wide, but lacked the strength to get up on his own since being admitted. Our time is done, he screamed in his head. Leave me alone. But she didn't. Phantoms from his past filed into the room with morbid politeness and placed themselves in a circle around him. They loomed at him, and he understood. The dead didn't hold secrets. They were too perfectly receptible to keep them buried under the endless waves of time. He would have to return one more time, at judgment. He let his head loll back and closed his eyes. Images flooded in where he had tried to keep them out. Red brick dust and steel blue metal bridges over an expanse of dazzling teal water. White tile at Sunnyside outdoor pool, and the rainbow of bathing suits and swim trunks sunbathing on the sandy beach, Toronto, 1953. Arthur was 13 then, smoothing his curly hair under a Blue Jays baseball cap in the mirror of the swimming pool change room, A boy his age came from behind, flip-flops echoing, then dumped his towel and toiletry bag in the sink and stood rubbing his eyes like he'd just woken up. Arthur pretended not to recognize him from the pool yesterday. "Hey," said the boy, "aren't you that kid that swims with his hat on?" Arthur reddened. "Aren't you that kid that's in love with Francesca?" The boy paused for a moment, then let out a short, sharp laugh. "Francesca's not even sexy. We just hang around because she's cool. You should see her friends, though." Arthur took off his hat and pretended to wash his face, like he wasn't planning on swimming with his hat on today, even though the thought of getting his hair wet made him nauseous. He turned to leave. "You should come meet him," said the boy, toothbrush foaming in his mouth. Arthur paused at the door. "Come on, what are you going to do? Hang around the can all day?" "They're a good bunch, I promise." Arthur was about to protest, but the boy's arm was already hooked around his neck, moving him towards the door. "My hat," he said. "You don't need it," said the boy. "I'm Terrence, by the way, but you can call me Terry." Outside, the sunlight was blinding. Terry walked him over to two girls lying on beach towels, one of whom wore mirrored sunglasses and the other with curly red hair. "Francesca, I found you a boyfriend," said Terry, tapped the one in mirrored sunglasses. Francesca blushed. "I already have a boyfriend, Terry." "Does he go to another school?" teased Terry. "For your information, he's in the army. He's very tall and very strong and very rich. Not that it's any of your business. But I suppose I can meet this friend of yours, just for the acquaintance." They looked at Arthur expectantly. He started. "You're Arthur, aren't you? From the grade below us," said the one with red hair. "No," he said. "Actually, we're in the same grade, grade 10. I just think maybe we don't have a lot of classes together. Maybe none." "A likely story," said Francesca. "Don't mind her," said the girl with red hair. "She's just upset because she's in love with Terry, but he's in love with me. I'm Rosa. Do you like anyone?" Arthur blushed again. "Maybe he's in love with Terry," snickered Francesca. "What's not to like?" said Terry. "Oh, all right," said Rosa. "Now that we're sure everyone's in love with everyone else, maybe we can finally go swimming." Terry signaled his assent by cannonballing into the pool, splashing the three friends. "Hey," called Rosa and dove in after him. They swam the remainder of the day, basking until they were red like lobsters and thoroughly cooked. Francesca had to go home at 6 or her mom would be upset, which left Terry, Rosa, and Arthur, lazy with sun and wrapped in towels, to stroll the pavilion barefoot as the sun set. Arthur felt like a third as Rosa and Terry bantered between each other, Terry proclaiming his undying love to her like an overwrought Shakespearean poet, and Rosa responding like an excessively British countess to refuse his advances. He felt his hair curling in odd patterns on his head as it dried, which was exposed without the hat still sitting in the bathroom. The sun was setting and the mosquitoes were coming out when Terry hiked off into the bushes to pee. Arthur and Rosa stood on the boardwalk, unsure of what to say. "You should come by with us more often," said Rosa. "Yeah," he said. "I mean, you don't have to do anything." You don't have to or anything. Oh, I know, of course. But you don't have to either have me, either. No. Just if I'm here. If you're here, she said, it would be nice. Arthur smiled at her and she smiled back. He didn't know what to say. "I should get home," he said. She nodded, and Terry returned from the bushes and put his arm around Rosa's neck. "Heading out?" said Terry. Arthur nodded, then left along the boardwalk, back to the shuttered pool to try and retrieve his hat. He was hit with a feeling then, the feeling that the atmosphere was a bit thinner, in this place and time, like he was more able to see his life from above. The same feeling he got when he stargazed on summer nights. Lonely, he walked on. Later, he would spend long hours alone wondering what he would have done had he known what followed. During the bitter years before he met Marilyn, he swore he'd never have come back to the pool. Or to the bridge. As he mellowed with age and his new marriage, he decided that maybe he would have just avoided his final night with Terry altogether and let chance take him where it would. But even then, some part of him felt bound, like what had happened was the only thing that could have happened, and the whole of his life looped around to that moment the same way a disc spins around its center. From his birth, he was heading towards that bridge, and everything that happened afterward was only heading away from it. The summer passed more quickly after that. He began going to the pool every morning, brushing his teeth in the bathroom like Terry had done, and waiting until the rest of his friends arrived. Sometimes it was Francesca who got there first, and they would swim and make conversation while waiting for the others to show. Sometimes Terry would arrive first, rumpled from sleep in a way that somehow gave him more charm. They became fast friends, and Terry was polite enough not to mention it when Arthur cut his hair like his or started going to the gym with him. Arthur would later realize with fear that Terry hadn't minded it when Arthur tried to seem like him. He wasn't flattered by it either. He was just happy and grateful to have Arthur as a friend. It was that thought that brought the most harm to Arthur in middle age, the thought that despite all the faults he could have blamed on Terry, he had the rarity of a good and sincere heart. As much as he liked Terry, the best days were when Rosa showed up first. He would take great care to not notice when she came in, waiting until she wordlessly set up her tower beside him to speak. They talked, awkwardly at first, but then earnestly, and eventually Arthur found himself sinking inescapably into love. They started spending more time together after Terry went home for the night, talking the night away. But then the summer ended, and Rosa said goodbye to her aunt and was driven by her uncle back into the States for school. They wrote, but even though they wrote to each other as earnestly as they had spoken, the possibility of anything between them became increasingly remote. Her letters came once a week, then once a month, then nothing. Arthur was 17 when she returned to the city in 1957. By then he'd grown to his full height, but was still lanky with curly hair and narrow shoulders. Terry had grown tall and strong, and their friendship had by that point become substantial as a tree with 100 roots. When Rosa returned, she had changed. The dying Arthur woke up from his dream coughing. He felt like there was sea foam stuck in his chest, and every cough only piled more into his throat. 2 nurses appeared and put an oxygen mask on his face. The other turned a valve and tried to get his attention. She blurred. Fever, Mr. Cummings. Treatment options. Here soon. Anyone to contact? He tried to wave her away, but only rolled his head away from her. The nurses prodded him and read out numbers on panels to each other, then jotted it down in a clipboard and left him alone. He drifted, bitter. He'd always thought of the hospital bed as a grim but reassuring cradle, his final container as he drained away, but now he realized it was Alcatraz. He would be held there against his will, with no bail for the duration of his trial. Marilyn was 10 in 1957 and 35 when they met in 82. By then, he was a husk. His 17 years as a single father were dense with both joy and horror, as the bright summers alternated with endless chemotherapy for Robin, his first daughter. He blamed himself. He had long stopped believing in the Christian God, and instead recognized only what he felt was inevitably true. The dark gods that tore at his soul and swallowed those he loved as greedily as they asked him to build more, to be more, to ripen him for his final slaughter. When she died, he scattered her ashes off the Alcove bridge in the morning sunrise. He had gained weight, and his new doctor would tell him during a checkup that it might be time to consider cholesterol medication or quit smoking. It was a no-brainer. They even cause cancer, he was told. He stopped going for checkups after that. Instead, he spent long hours on the bridge so he wouldn't be at home. The house had been cleaned out by a concerned neighbor and by Francesca, who had never suspected a thing, even though she could have. And all that remained was the only thing he asked Francesca not to take, the bed. White-framed aluminum with adjustable height, the penultimate resting place for Robin, and he thought at the time, perhaps his own as well. But his wish for death wasn't granted. Instead, he bumped into a stranger on the bridge one night. "Mourning?" she asked. He looked at her, steered from his trance, and tried to make sense of her words. It was dusk and the sun was setting. The water under the bridge had dried up with the tide and only mud was left below him until sunrise. He winced. The perfect time to relive his favorite nightmare. "No, I think it's well past, he said. The woman chuckled. It was a light laugh, like someone finally relieved of heavy baggage. No, she said. I mean, are you mourning? This is our cove, after all. Alcove, you mean, he corrected. She leaned on the railing beside him. Have you ever looked at it on a map? Our Cove Bridge, a humanist graveyard. It hasn't been called the Alcove for years. What did you think all the locks were for? Arthur examined the bridge and found bike locks and padlocks linked into the railing. Aren't those for teenage couples? He said, turning his eyes away from the lock he knew was below him. T plus R plus A inside a heart. No, said the woman. On other bridges, maybe, but this bridge is special. It was a mourners group that claimed it in '68. These locks are for the dead. Arthur was overcome with nausea. He felt like someone was playing a joke on him. So all these locks, he started. Yes, she said. That's why I ask. Anyone who comes here every day must have lost someone. Have you lost someone? Asked Arthur. Niece, she said. Suicide. Daughter, said Arthur. Cancer. They stood there for a while, talking, tentatively at first, but then set off walking away from the bridge into the night. Weeks later, they would come back and put a new lock on the bridge. Robin. Lost in his dream, old Arthur felt a pressure on his hand. The voice seemed like it was coming from beyond the plaster wall. Dad, it said. It took him a moment to realize it was Mary, his daughter with Marilyn. He opened his eyes, but they were so blurry he could only make out a darker shape where Mary must have stood. Mary, he struggled. Take me away from these things. They loom so, watching. They want me to tell it all. But Mary didn't understand him from beyond the oxygen mask. She sensed his agitation and spoke to the nurse, who turned the valve and sent him relaxing further into sleep. He would come to tell Marilyn everything, or thereabouts. He told her about how he met Terry and Rosa. He would tell her about Terry's funeral, even the shameful bits. They were too young for a funeral, which was a contentious statement all by itself. He thought at the time, since most people he knew had already been to at least one or two. He was wearing his only suit, black tie and white shirt, but he was already too big for the pants. Rosa was at his arm, practically glued to him. They had been inseparable throughout the entire process. The panicked run down the dark hill, the paramedics hustling up with Terry, still breathing, a miracle, unbelievable, a ray from God. Then the coma. Francesca's wailing, the endless euphemisms, pulling the plug, kicking the can, letting him off easy. Endless masculine obfuscations told in bars and smoking outside house parties. My best friend is in a coma. It's been a week, but he's healing. I'm not done with him just yet. A chuckle to lighten the mood. Then a week became a month, became a year, just became is. My best friend is in a coma. He may never wake up. The mood was somber as people milled around. Francesca's mother was talking to Terry's father, a widower who now had only nieces and nephews. Seeing this, Rosa held on to him even tighter. This is what you wanted, thought Arthur as he looked at Rosa. Was it worth it? Be careful what you wish for. Afterward, the three of them sat outside, smoking. After a long silence, Francesca spoke. You ever feel like the hard things in your life are payments for the good, or the other way around? She said. Rosa nodded. I thought when my mother died, I had paid in advance. Like having lost the person I loved most, I would have a free pass for the rest of life. I mean, what are the odds of the same thing happening twice? Rosa went over and hugged her. Maybe this is it. Maybe there's no more price left to pay. Francesca didn't hug back. You're wrong, she said. There's always more. Always more, thought Arthur. Those words had stuck with him. It was the exact words he remembered, with perfect clarity, at Robin's funeral, like they were being said from directly behind him. There's always more price to pay. But at long last, somehow, he had paid the price. Marilyn appeared at just the right moment in his life. He told her the story, how Rosa had returned the summer of '57 fully grown and graduated, how she had so many plans to travel Canada, then the States, then the world. And she didn't want to do it alone. All summer they drank and partied, but now and then he'd get a sense of dissatisfaction. There would be days she couldn't get out of bed, days she was irritable, and days she would say nothing at all. But she kept them hidden, and instead of the distance finally being closed, it broadened between them. But she would still talk to Terry sometimes, on the phone. Something about Arthur made her pause. The summer dream was ending, and fall was setting in. It happened on a humid night in September. They were drinking like they always were and decided to go to Alcove, which they then thought was Alcove Bridge. Terry ran ahead and Rosa sprinted after him, with Arthur bringing up the rear. They arrived breathless at the bridge, and Arthur was stunned. Rosa looked beautiful. The streetlight reflected off her hair as she looked at him, breathless, and laughed. A happy night. One of her few in recent times. He remembered the talking, the teasing and playfulness, the long walks and heartfelt confessions. How she looked when she was telling the stories of her childhood, growing up far north. How they held hands when Terry wasn't around and looked at each other, almost leaning in for a kiss. Almost, but not quite, just enough to send Arthur off the deep end, into the howling blackness of an endless and unrequited love. And then Terry leaning in and hugged her hanging onto his broad back with both hands as she twirled around. All of them dizzy with wine. They laughed, but Arthur's heart turned to ice. They had brought a padlock, scratching T plus R plus A, in with some screws borrowed from Rosa's uncle, and locked it into the bridge. "I'm going to go get changed," said Rosa, skipping off into the bushes. "But that's not for us, chum," said Terry. "Because we're men," he said, taking Arthur by the shoulders and shaking him. "Man!" Arthur couldn't help but laugh as they stripped down to nothing and climbed over the railing to stand at the top. It was a moonless night, and blackness pulled beneath them. They waited, swaying with drink, for Rosa to join them. "I wanted to ask you," said Terry. "What?" said Arthur. "Her and I were thinking of driving to BC, he said. Arthur's chest tightened. "And?" said Arthur. Terry looked at him. "I was just worried you might not be able to make it," said Terry. Then he jumped. There was a long silence where Arthur expected to hear splashing but didn't, hearing only the wind. Then he heard the wet smack of bones on mud, as ordinary a sound as he had ever heard. Except, of course, it wasn't ordinary. Rosa came running out of the bushes, still smiling. "Where's Terry?" she asked. "I think the tide is out," said Arthur. She didn't understand what he meant, but saw the stunned look on his face. Rosa looked at him until she understood. Then they both stumbled down the hill, adrenaline closing their throats so the approach was silent. Then came the desperation, the panic. Arthur running door to door, naked, yelling, wailing, asking if someone please could call an ambulance right away. He told Marilyn he was ashamed because in the hospital there had been some part of him that was glad Terry was in a coma. Some part of him that was glad to see Rosa clinging to his arm at the funeral. Some small, resilient piece of him, the animal, cannibal, drooling white fangs, had been happy to lose a friend and gain a lover. And it hadn't mattered anyway. Rosa killed herself from what Arthur would later be told was called postpartum depression. Robin would die of bone cancer. The debts, bitter, impossible prices, had been paid. He had lived in prosperity with Marilyn for 40 years and raised Mary, and had even lived 10 years after Marilyn's death. It was over. "That's it," he said aloud, to the phantoms filling the hospital room. "Now let me die." The phantoms pondered his words but didn't move. A black figure moved forward. It was Rosa. She leaned forward in his ear and whispered, "Liar." He choked on his breath, then coughed and struggled to breathe in again. Then she said it again, "Liar." And Terry's phantom leaned in and said it, "Liar." His mother, Marilyn, Robin's phantoms joined in one by one, "Liar, liar, liar, liar," until it became a chant. An alarm went off beside him, and 3 nurses ran in with a rolling tray and began hooking things to him, turning valves and preparing injections. "Liar, liar, liar, liar." "Dad?" Mary choked, but was pushed away from the nurse as a doctor ran into the room. He's having a cardiac episode, shouted a nurse. Liar, liar, liar. Arthur coughed blood and ripped his mask off and stumbled out of bed onto the gurney. I pushed him, he yelled. I pushed him, I pushed him, I pushed him. Liar, 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 liar. I pushed him and I prayed for him to die, and I was glad, he shouted, and the voices stopped. And before he knew it, he was gone. End.